Well, this is the occasional video conversation for the Theophantastique podcast. It's also going to be the transcript. This is going to be the first ever interview that's going to be in the Journal of Gods and Monsters, the peer-reviewed academic journal. And I'm privileged to have today a conversation with two guests, Barrett and Jessica Burgin. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, you are.
And they're filmmakers, and together they own Burgindie Pictures, which is a great name. And their collaborative work includes the acclaimed shorts "The Angel" from 2024, which we're going to be talking about unpacking today, "Java Jive" from 2025. They are recognized for their engagement with Latter-day Saint theology, folk belief, and the simultaneous celebration and critique of Mormon thought and culture. So this will be a fascinating conversation. So again, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much, John. Really, really honored to be part of this.
Well,
Appreciate
great. I'm looking forward to it as well. I'd like to begin getting some aspects of your personal story. For those who may not know your work, could you share a bit about your background, where you grew up, your relationship to Mormonism, and how that has been personally as well as culturally?
Yeah,
Sure.
kick us off.
Yeah, of course. So Jessica and I live in East Tennessee, and that's where we met and grew up together, actually. And we're childhood sweethearts. So we went to high school together, and that's actually kind of when we started making films. They're no good, and we're not going to send them to you. And so we still work together today. Jessica usually does more producing, and I'm typically more of the writer director, but The Angel especially felt like such a story about kind of gender and marriage and religion that we thought, I was like, Jessica, do you want to direct this with me? But we both work professionally full time in film. We are active, believing Latter-day Saints, both born and raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But have spent kind of the past decade or so building a little bit of a name for ourselves, at least within our circles, in exploring, examining, and taking new approaches to telling our cultural story. I'm a firm believer that great storytelling and great filmmaking is widely accessible, and it becomes widely accessible by being hyper specific. And ironically, that like, when we watch a movie, particularly about a religious denomination that we might not understand, so long as the film is made for a general audience, it actually benefits from being hyper specific and unique, just as long as we can follow along and understand that it's not insular or kind of excludes the audience based on insider knowledge. And so while our films absolutely have kind of insider elements that, if you know that flavor, it's like, oh my gosh, that's exactly it. We're really committed to telling broad stories, and particularly as far as horror is concerned, that's a very accessible genre.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
anything you want
I
to
mean,
add
that was
to
a
our?
perfect introduction. I don't know that there's a
Oh,
lot more
thanks.
to say. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. How has Mormonism shaped your creative imagination, not just religiously, but aesthetically, emotionally, narratively?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's personally, I think, sort of second nature for us is we were raised in very active Latter-day Saint homes, and we still participate in the faith, but we grew up in an area where there were not a lot of other people who belonged to the religion. And so I think that, in terms of storytelling and filmmaking, we have really wanted to find this sort of balance between, being specific to certain like themes and experiences that explore our identity and our background, but that don't feel didactic, that feel nuanced and something that's accessible to a wide audience. And I think that, at least for me, growing up sort of having to like explain who I am and what my beliefs are and what, why things are a certain way in terms of like specific standards or beliefs or whatnot. I think that I feel very comfortable talking about myself in a way that people who don't have personal experience with it can appreciate it. And so I think that sort of naturally lends itself to the way that we try to tell stories in such a way that it can be understood by a wide audience. maybe especially appreciated by someone who has some existing knowledge or experience with it, but it's not contingent upon that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really well put. And I would probably maybe just to add to that, I'd say that there's probably three ways that Mormonism kind of contributes to the creative imagination. The first is in writing and in filmmaking, there's kind of just the adage like write what you know. And it's something we know really, really well. We know intimately. Um and the second piece of that is that it is unique and kind of inaccessible to a lot of people. See, still even today, we see so many people kind of misunderstanding and wondering about, who are the Latter-day Saints, who are the Mormons, and there's this really between the two of those aspects. Um, there's this kind of tragic irony, I think, that in the ways that Latter-day Saints tend to tell their own story, they I feel that a lot of times Latter-day Saints are often kind of over advocating for themselves and trying to explain to an audience why they're so normal and just like you. And it's like, hey, we're just people too. And you may know this, John, but there's such a long history of both persecution and then also kind of image control response in terms of like, well, we really want to be thought well of and we have good intentions. And this has like cultural implications in terms of gatekeeping and kind of guarding, telling maybe more uplifting or devotional stories. And so that becomes this really interesting dichotomy because on the one hand, um, not all Latter-day Saints are particularly good at telling their own story in a compelling way that's not immediately trying to be devotional. And then on the other hand, you can just see it in the market. You can just see like year over year the market demand for people they don't necessarily want to be preached to, but they definitely want access to kind of the fascination of the world. And so when it comes to writing what you know, it's like, well, why wouldn't I write this? Like I understand this intimately, and then I also understand that in film, that's exactly what you don't want to do is try to convince the audience of something. You just want to bring them into a story and into the world, and the more authentic it is, and the more questions that it asks, the better the story. And then, ironically, perhaps the more heavy the theological implications and kind of theme actually benefits from that. And then the third reason is just like it's hard for me to separate the creative imagination from religious faith. Like you said, like, but don't think of it religiously, think of it in a creative aspect. But like, Latter-day Saint history and doctrine is just so interesting to me. It's intense. It's fascinating. The story of the church history, and I mean the true story. I mean the more complicated story than perhaps the necessarily really really devotional kind of hyper focused on the uplifting. Um, and I don't think there's a way, even as a believing, active member of the faith, I don't think one can look at Mormonism kind of writ large and not see creative imagination in the sort of new and kind of radical approach to this Christian and Abrahamic, larger Abrahamic, approach. And so to me, that just gives tons of aesthetic and kind of like thematic playground to play with. And so it's not exclusively all we want to do, but we keep going back to it because there's a demand for it. We understand it, and it doesn't feel like a whole lot of other people are doing it in the perhaps in the most like culturally authentic way. There's risk that comes with it, and we'd be happy to talk to you about some of that. But it threads this needle a little bit. So anyway, maybe too long of an
Yeah.
answer, but
Well, when I hear you mention that um, tension, perhaps in what you do, it reminds me. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Mormon sociologist Armand Moss and his book, The Angel and the Beehive, and he talks
oh,
about
I have heard of that book,
yeah,
but
there's this oscillation in Mormon culture between wanting to be unique and kind of retrenching, but at the same time want to say we're just like everybody else.
yeah.
So it sounds like you're describing some of that tension that you feel in your artistic work. Would that be correct?
Oh, for sure. In fact, even outside of the artistic work, I just think the assimilative, kind of the assimilative impulse is always a bad one. And I don't, retrenchment's a good way to put it because I don't think that art should retrench, if that makes sense. There's a difference perhaps between like a doctrinal or cultural retrenchment in sort of like kind of trying to maintain narrative or authority. That's not
Propagandistic.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that's not exactly what I mean, but rather kind of leaning into the peculiarity, into the uniqueness, into the even the esotericism and like I mentioned before, that in my view, ironically, and just kind of the media theory behind that is that actually is more universal. That actually tends to be more accessible. People tend to like it more if you have something unique to say and you're upfront. And that's no reason to do it, just for people to like you more. It's just that like if what you're worried about is people liking you and assimilating and being normal, then how tragically ironic to do the exact opposite thing and try so hard to be normal and cool. That's off-putting. And our experience in East Tennessee, growing up in the kind of the evangelical South, is that religion's everywhere. It's constantly a topic of discussion. It was for us in high school, and I found a lot more respect and kind of interfaith like relationship by being myself and by like really owning the Mormonism and not kind of trying to explain it in a way that's persuading someone
Mhm.
that it's identical. So I
Or
hope,
just like, this is who I am. This is my story.
yeah,
You know.
yeah, there tends to be kind of a there kind of tends to sometimes be like an in-group out-group, not in terms of like exclusion, but like, okay, we'll talk about this stuff at home and at church, but when it comes to kind of with the wide world, like, don't bring up collab, don't bring up polygamy, don't bring up these things, and those are the things that people are like, what even is that? What are you talking about? And are the things that are fascinating. And The Angel, our film, has had that exact effect where like, you know, many Latter-day Saints really, really like and resonate with the film. And many people who know nothing about Mormonism really like and resonate with the film. But there have been some within the faith context that are like, did we need this? Like why did you make this? And it's like, why wouldn't we make it? It's like, well, there's nothing really like inaccurate about it, but I just
It's
don't think you should be talking
uncomfortable.
about this. And it's
It's
that
uncomfortable.
yeah, that right there is the place where I think we're a little bit fascinated
Mhm.
because I think there are larger, even ethical and sociological implications around like that question, even outside of Mormonism. Like, should we be talking about this? It's
Mhm.
like, okay, now we're at the truth of something. Now we're kind of in the center of the maze, if you
Yeah.
will.
Mhm. We'll unpack some of how this moves from the personal into the film itself in a little bit, but I'm interested in how were there stories, doctrines, historical episodes, folk beliefs within Mormon culture that fascinated and maybe unsettled you early on, and over time you decided artistically you wanted to address these, and it came out later in films like The Angel?
That's a really good
Yeah,
question.
I'll take a first stab at this and then jump in with whatever you want.
Sure.
But I have always been fascinated by history, by learning people's stories from the past. And particularly like I love historical fiction that sort of helps you connect with people in a time and place to help you understand events and things that happened in a more emotionally connective way. But so given that, I actually in my own family history, I have ancestors who were there from like very early stages of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, like from when it was organized in New York. And then, people who came across the country. So I actually have some ancestors who lived like just a few miles away from where we filmed The Angel. And the story is fictitious. It's not based on real events, but it is inspired by recorded experiences and journals in part. So yeah, I actually had some ancestors who practiced polygamy during the time that our film is set um, in the same area of Utah regionally, and they had reports, and this wasn't just from my own ancestors, but there were like supernatural experiences that people had with, kind of spirits in the desert and stories of like not necessarily temptation, but like you know, warnings about deceiving spirits or things coming, sort of like hauntings, or terrorizing spirit experiences type things. And so, yeah, we definitely pulled from some of that historically for this film. So, like I said, the story beats are not pulled from a specific experience, but sort of just, a collection of things that feel like it's in the spirit of what occurred based on people's journals and recorded experiences during that time period.
Mm.
I think for me, what I would start out, I was trying to remember, I was looking it up and I couldn't remember his name, but when I was in film school, so I went to BYU film school, and one of the classes that we took was film theory, and several of these theories stick with me, even though the theorists, I'm like, who was it that said that? But one of them was like film as a mirror, right? Film functions as this really interesting mirror when we kind of project ourselves onto the characters or onto the ideas that the film is examining. And to your question about like elements of culture or doctrine that, like fueled artistry, but also maybe were either fascinating or uncomfortable. I think that Mormonism, just kind of as a subject matter, when it comes to religiosity, when it comes to maybe Christianity specifically, also kind of functions as a mirror because there are these elements of Mormonism that one already finds in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. But the Latter-day Saint movement kind of takes them to their logical end or their logical conclusion and kind of examines them. And I'll explain what I mean in conjunction with your question. So, I think in varying degrees of discomfort and or kind of reconciliation or like exploration, um, there are kind of three elements in the angel that you also find in the Bible, which is first like testing spirits and like that spirits might deceive you, and maybe in a larger philosophical capacity, like I'm really fascinated by the idea of deception, and that like. And so is Joseph Smith. So is a lot of his early writings in Doctrine and Covenants 129, which shows up in the film, Doctrine and Covenants section 50. There's this kind of hyperfixation on diverse spirits, and you want to be careful if an angel comes and appears to you, and like what does the angel say, and there's even this entire kind of cosmology and methodology for testing spirits, and that's why she reaches out to shake his hand. On the one hand, it can read like, are you real, like touching the Ark of the Covenant, it's like what is the divine, and be careful. But on the other hand, there's an actual kind of maybe like there's a mechanic to it. And of course,
Specific instructions
yes,
or
and of course the irony is not lost on us as Latter-day Saints that like this is a common kind of broader Christian argument against Mormonism, is it's like, well, this angel showed up, and Joseph Smith talks about this story, and like, can we believe him? And so on the foundational level, we wanted the film to kind of function both ways, that it's like it is both kind of an enactment of a legitimizing of a Latter-day Saint cosmology within the universe of the film, and at the same time, kind of a comment on that. It's ironic a little bit because it's like, and Mormonism falls into this question. Um, and the idea of spirits showing up and giving you messages and telling you weird things is just very fascinating to me. The next step up, I would say, of course, is polygamy, which again is an extension of what you already find in the Old Testament, especially if you take the Hebrew Bible, kind of at face value, without any sort of apologetics or suggesting, well, God's a lot bigger. God had a bigger plan, and like, Abraham tried it his way, and then God tried it his way. Like
if
when
we were to understand
if we're understanding the stories and the characters
Mm-hmm.
on the basis of the Hebrew Bible and sort of the midrash around it and the Jewish interpretation, that's not what it's suggesting. We have this biblical reckoning with polygamy, and Mormonism again serves as this sort of mirror, as this extension of like, do we like that? How do we feel about that? And so in diving into the history for the film, it was really, really interesting to read the women's voices. Jessica has her own ancestry that we read, these journals, and found that, like any marriage, like any society, is complicated. It worked for a lot of people. It didn't work for a lot of people. In the film, we are coming at it with the kind of like this woman is having a crisis of faith, and over that particular issue. And a lot of people do and did. And it's very uncomfortable for Latter-day Saints, except it is this like foundational, integral part, at least of the Brighamite branch of the church. That's a huge, huge identifier.
Something that very much set us apart and continues to set us apart from other Christian denominations in the US and throughout the world. And so it's definitely a unique aspect of it that is uncomfortable, particularly when Latter-day Saints feel uncomfortable
Yeah,
discussing
that's right.
unusual
Yes. So
sacred
is it
beliefs.
troubling? Is it, I mean, for me personally, I guess for both of us, because we've talked about this, like, is it troubling to us? No, like not more so than it is already in a biblical context, but it is uncomfortable because it's uncomfortable in this larger aspect of how people feel around it, and we're counting on that, which is why we wanted to kind of use it as a vehicle for it's sort of the metaphor for the faith, if you will. And then finally, what I actually do have more complex feelings about would be the violence. Would be violence in like on the kind of errand of God, or violence sort of against the righteous, if you will, and like where violence and faith intersect. The angel actually cites Brigham Young talking about blood atonement and like this concept within old Mormon theology that as part of the repentance process is you have to make restitution. And it's like, yes, Christ, it's Christ that covers repentance through his grace and the atonement, but you have to make restitution. And like you can't make restitution if you killed somebody in cold blood. And so you offer blood as this payment. And to me, like that and how that's tied to the Old Testament, and you do have angels coming and requesting sacrifices, and like sort of muddying the water within that context is, to me, meant to ask a larger question. And it's been effective because people have read it both ways and been like, well, that angel's clearly good because he's telling him not to practice polygamy. So how does he do it? He turns around and tells them to kill somebody. And you can also flip those things depending on the way in which you're reading it. So
Hmm. I'm interested in your work creatively as filmmakers. What were the influences, cinematic influences that you bring together, and how did that come together for you to form Burgundy Pictures?
Yeah, that's a
it's a
great question.
really good question.
I'll have to think about it in terms of like Burgundy Pictures on the whole. For the Angels specifically, like I could talk about specific references for that. Um, one that uh, our producer and I were really interested in was women talking. Um, and that film, I think, is very effective at accessing the women in that story where they are, based on what they believe and what's important to them. And I just think it's really fascinating to explore that faith and the things that they're grappling with, sort of on their own terms. And in a way where they're arguing with each other, but it's from a shared place. And so I think that was really fascinating. And that was something that sort of inspired things that we put into the angel in terms of like a discussion between the two women in the story, where they're coming from a shared background and faith and sort of arguing with each other based on their shared identity and beliefs.
Yeah, Doubt does that too. So a few other specific artistic references would be like just in terms of cinematography, like Bergman
Mm-hmm.
using persona. Persona does a lot of like kind of looking toward the camera or through the camera or using blocking to create tension. And so we did just kind of straight up like lift from Persona a little
Mm-hmm.
bit and from Seventh Seal. Obviously, obviously, The Witch is kind of an obvious. Reference in terms of pace, in terms of historicity. Um, this isn't particularly a film reference, but we did do a film out process, which means we shot it digitally with the intent to print onto 16 millimeter film. And so you have to shoot it all just a little bit lifted. So it's a little bit overexposed. then you do the cut, you do a color pass, but you're prepping for printing it to 16 millimeter, and then printed it on 16 millimeter, scan it digitally back, and then do the last fine tuning of coloring. So it gives it that historic kind of texture.
Mhm.
And so the way that I don't know, like the way that Robert Eggers puts so much attention to detail on the history, we wanted to give it the Robert Eggers treatment in terms of the accuracy of the time period, and
Mhm.
even like the ideology of these particular Latter-day Saints in time that might not necessarily reflect contemporary Latter-day Saint sentiments, and we felt like that was necessary in order to kind of take some larger dramatic swings. Is it's like let's root it in place. Let's make sure the
Mhm.
production design. Another one is Picnic at Hanging Rock, if you've ever seen that, in terms of this the space and the environment, putting it in southern Utah and letting the red rock in the caves do a lot of the the heavy lifting in
And
terms
yeah,
of space, and then also in the edit. What were you
well, I
gonna
was
say?
going to say, in the environment sort of acting as its own character,
Yes.
because that's a big part of it is this feeling of isolation and desolation, in the middle of the desert.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I'm trying to think
if there's
of
anything else we
there
pulled
were
from
other ones. There were so
specifically, yeah.
many things we looked at to kind of try to oh well I'll say this, John. We also, I mean, the way that we structured the story, um first of all, our fantastic screenwriter Daniel too,
Mhm.
just really made the language like rooted in the time. So the angel speaks in kind of 14th or 15th century King James English, and the women are speaking in 19th century, Utah, Western United States English. And and we we tried to structure the story like a fable, almost like a fairy tale, like a Hans Christian Andersen, or a Grimm Brothers fairy tale or a fable, or like
We wanted to feel
an
folkloric.
Old Testament
Mhm.
story, kind of parable-like, and that's why the characters don't have names. That's why the story can kind of be read a number of
Mhm.
ways. The ambiguity was intentional. We certainly have like a director's intent, and it's there, and I feel like the film kind of speaks for itself. But we've gotten a lot of interpretations, and that's exactly what we wanted because we were copying the ways this older form of storytelling doesn't quite give you all the aspects, and it always ends in a way that's a little bit like, oh, huh,
Mhm.
and so we tried to kind of emulate that a little bit.
Yeah.
That's great. I was intrigued when I first heard about the angel and then heard that this was dealing with Mormon subject matter because conservative Mormonism is not, to the best of my knowledge, known for embracing horror. I come from a conservative Protestant background and I engage horror regularly on a popular and academic level, and I get a lot of pushback
Mhm.
from folks in my own religious community that's an inappropriate genre to be exploring for conservative religious sensibilities. So, what is it that drew you, with your Mormon background, to horror in order to tell these kinds of stories?
I think if you would have asked me as a teenager, I would be like, I would never make a horror film. Uh, but I think that um, growing up and maturing as an adult has shown me that horror is often a reflection of reality, and I think that it deals with, kind of as we touched on earlier, a lot of topics that sometimes we don't want to look at, we don't want to discuss. And so I think that horror as a genre sort of provides opportunity for you to comment on things that people don't want to look at and don't want to face, but it gives you an opportunity to do it in a way that you're engaging with art to speak to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I need to talk more. John, I have these long answers. I have so much I want to say, and I'm sorry, I am a chatterbox, so I
That's okay.
apologize. But I'm gonna talk about this. So I I get the sensibility, like I understand kind of the conservative, sensitive sensibility, and we read in the New Testament about like the gifts of the Spirit, and we read about like Christ telling us that um uh that he like he gives us peace, like not as the world gives, but he gives. And so like I can see why we got to where we are. And maybe I'll be preaching to the choir here, I don't know. But I feel like one cannot separate religious like storytelling from horror. I feel like it's baked into the DNA. I don't even have to dip into Mormonism to give this foundation because it's just an extension of this kind of dichotomy. There, it's like it's telling to me, and I'm just going to speak about this like from a devotional perspective. It is telling to me that there are all these stories in just the New Testament of Christ casting out demons and devils, and like that's included. Satan takes Christ and tempts him in three different ways, and we know that like when he's fasting for 40 days, as he's about to like move forward in his ministry, you've got this other character of Satan that always shows up. And that there are even these kind of horrific consequences and elements that are not just confined to the Old Testament. I think it's Herod that gets like eaten by worms, like in front of everybody,
Yeah,
and
gnarly stuff.
yeah, gnarly stuff. And the Passion itself is this very violent sacrifice that God gives Himself, for because He loves the world, and I don't think that means that we need to like well I definitely feel certain that that means that doesn't mean we need to be a violent people. That doesn't mean that we need to live in horror or like kind of go down these dark avenues and sort of relish in it. But if we can't conceive of dark things, then we're closing our eyes to the reality of the nature of things. That the world is filled with light and dark, no matter what religious persuasion you are. We just know this is the case. And when I even think about like, things I'm seeing that we're seeing in the world around us, and like more and more information coming to light of just like horrific stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I
I
think I think we felt even more strongly like horror is worth engaging
it's
with in
worth it's
recent history,
yes,
like since we made this
that's right.
film.
It's worth engaging with because I'm of the opinion that it's not intentional, but those who cannot conceive of evil are necessarily complicit in upholding it. Because evil and darkness and violence and terror, like from an ethical standpoint, these things like are relying on ignorance. And from like a spiritual standpoint, um I think that there is catharsis that comes with dealing with these things, and not all horror is the same. But when it comes to something that is like kind of an examination of theology or an examination of faith or an examination of deception, like horror is the most natural medium. I'll give you an example. I looked up, some of what you've written about before we talked with you, but even like in the context of Genesis, when it comes to um, stories like of Abraham or particularly of Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark like really really is upsetting to people and or like what happens to Jericho. I think that sometimes it's easy to kind of dismiss the story and our discomfort with the story, which I think is a healthy discomfort. But it's like, oh well, they were all wicked, or it was all just bad, and God just did what he did. The inverse of that, I would say, is also that sometimes we just don't really read or focus on the stories because they're incomprehensible to us, because darkness is incomprehensible to us, because horror is incomprehensible to us. And like, as I read Noah's Ark this year, at the beginning of the year, kind of in the context of some of the darker things of this world, it had new meaning to me. The idea of like renewal and things being washed away. It's like, I can say that if I were in a position where horrible things were happening to me, I would rather be with God. Like, and to be able to engage with the story in some way that is not just like, well, we don't get this because of our modern kind of very comfortable and very delicate and kind of fragile like sense of society. these are old books and old stories written for an old time, and like that's sort of what's underneath everything, you know. And I actually think that it's through great storytelling that we're able to comprehend of lessons and ideas and leave those things behind, leave violence, leave, have hope for a better world, So anyway, I know that's kind of maybe, I hope that's not like word vomit there, but I just think that like that it's so integral to the kind of all of religion and to the Christian scriptures themselves. And it's just baffling to me when Christian art tends to be so saccharine and soft and kind of very like black and white, like there's the bad guys and there's the good guys. And that's not what I read when I read the scriptures. I read something that's very complex, very sophisticated, and kind of operating on multiple levels. And so like I think there's a thousand ways to justify the genre in a sort of academic and secular sense, but like where it intersects with religion, that to me is it's like I feel like the uphill battle is to point out where horror is left out of the equation because
Mhm.
it's already in there.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, you come from a conservative religious community, as do I, and
Yeah.
my operating theory has been that conservative religious communities tend to develop a sanitized version of their faith.
1 billion%.
Yeah, and then when they see things like horror, well, that is viewed as incompatible. When if you look, as you've already mentioned, at the sacred texts and the history of religion, it's far more complex and dark. I mean, just you mentioned Noah's Ark.
Hmm.
My wife used to teach Sunday school classes for children, and they would have the little flannel graphs and the children's books. But when you really look at the unvarnished story, it's pretty terrible about God wiping out all of humanity with the exception of a handful. That's pretty dark stuff. And
Mhm.
so sometimes even God himself can be seen as acting monstrously. So do you think there's something to that perhaps horror, if we let it, can provide us with a window to grapple not with just moral issues, but also the darker, more troubling aspects of each religious tradition?
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think
Mhm.
that story is only valuable when it's taken in 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 its entirety. I think it's meant to be a troubling story. And there's a surface level reading of it, I think, but I really do genuinely believe the kind of the sacred stories become more profound when you take the leap of faith and sort of risk it offending you in some capacity, offending your sensibilities. Just like what's God up to here? Like what is this story about? And this gets into a question of how literally to take it. The thing is like we already live in that world. We already live in the natural world, and the natural world's a violent world. We think about it from the comfort of our own homes, but if we were to go out into nature and like understand how animals interact with each other and how like survival of the fittest operates, like the natural man, the natural world, the foundational thing that we can demonstrate empirically is a violent place. And it's actually only through some concept, like a concept like grace, like divinity, like condescension, that suddenly gains meaning and it gains utility and it gains like, okay, like maybe there's something more that we can build out of it. It's not to disrupt, ethics in their place, but at least from where I stand, at the end of the day, you know what is it in Ecclesiastes, like it's all like everything there's nothing new under the sun and it's all the same and our lives pass by
Yeah.
and without this sense of divine justice and mercy and a moral authority that can make sense of what already is like inherent that we can observe. It's still to some extent nihilistic because it's like, but to what end? To what end? Like why? Why is this here? And I know those are kind of challenging and scary questions, I think, for a lot of people. Suddenly it's very heady, but it's like,
But I think everyone comes to a point where you have to ask those questions
yes.
to make sense of life itself. Like, I think if you consider the origin of all ancient religions, religion is something that was developed to make sense of the natural world. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think particularly in our modern society, in somewhere like the United States, we have so many luxuries that we forget, kind of as Barrett said, what it's like to be in the natural world. We're not necessarily concerned about our survival in the same way that a lot of groups and civilizations were, because we're so comfortable.
And what people will do to other people,
Uh-huh.
like wickedness as a concept. Wickedness is sort of a moral prescription, and it's like, like kind of purity culture and legalism. That's not what I'm getting at, and that has like real problems. But wickedness and like sin, these are however we want to categorize them. Like people do terrible things to each other, and I think that it is only through like kind of waking up to that fact that one can read something like the stories in Genesis, like Noah's Ark, like what happens in in Exodus and Jericho and the plagues, like only by looking at it through that context and understanding this is an old story, does it kind of gain value. And John, I'm of the opinion that like that actually creates, in terms of the gulf and the opposition between the two, more light and more hope and more peace, because those things actually mean something. They have something to be contrasted against. That sort of the concept of Satan is very useful because it is the exact inverse opposite of God and his goodness. And so the goodness only becomes useful when we're willing to understand that badness exists, but it can't just be kind of shoved away as this thing that actually ironically desensitizes us to people, to others, and just be like, yeah, those are the bad people. We're the good people. I know that kind of is maybe paradoxical, but so is God.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Well, let's talk a little more specifically about the film The Angel.
okay.
Where did the initial idea come from? What was there a particular spark or image or something that led to it for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of connected to it started with me, and Jessica was going to be involved as a producer before I said, "Do you want to direct this with me?" Um, but there's a feature version that was written before the short film even existed, called The Third Wife. It's the same setting. Um, the angel character is the same, but everyone else it's different. It's a feature film that's a totally different story.
Yeah, the short film is a proof of
It's
concept
sort of a
for the
proof of
long
concept for
feature
that.
that we thought
And
we're developing first.
And the feature is not a fable. It's a real story about characters with names, and they're grappling with some of these
It's
same
fiction.
themes. But it's fiction. Um, and where it started kind of ties back to your previous question, which is that I just kept seeing this rich opportunity within Latter-day Saint kind of theology and culture and cinema generally, like just within the arts, um, to explore this, because it was unrepresented. It's like it's right here in our texts. It's right here, kind of in our most sacred liturgy. Like Satan shows up as this character, and the Book of Mormon has this verse about kind of dissecting how the devil works. Um, and this has become more important to me with time. I think at the time it was just mostly a justification to explore it's like, well, we should be telling horror stories too. But
It was also, knowing some of these topics were not represented, as you said.
yeah,
And then considering, well, how would I tell a
how would I tell
story
that
that
story?
depicts that aspect of history? You're like, I actually don't know how I could do it unless it's a horror
Exactly.
because
Well,
there's such discomfort around the
yeah,
topic.
this verse in the Book of Mormon, talks about, the devil says, "I am no devil, for there is none," and like all is well. And like, I kind of connected that to like, well, why don't we talk about these stories? Even if it's not for some kind of faith justified reason, that's at least enough room to like be telling this kind of story. And so, yeah, as Jessica said, I started to wonder like, what would a Mormon horror film look like? We've seen lots of Catholic, for example, and I will say, like, some are more Catholic in their DNA than others. I would say that The Exorcist is like a deeply Catholic film, and kind of faith promoting. Um, and
Ultimately,
ultimately,
yeah.
even though it's
Mhm.
this like horrific movie, and The Exorcist examines itself, the fact that like there is this question about whether this girl needs an exorcism, and even the Catholics are doubting that, and they're like, well, it could be all of these other things, and what about this? And it is only toward the end that it's like, okay, now we're going to take it seriously. The film earns that by kind of interrogating itself. And and so sort of the germ of this idea came from like, what would a Mormon horror film look like? It would necessarily be rooted in kind of these Abrahamic theological questions and concepts, but the flavor of the thing is going to be uniquely Latter-day Saint. And so that's why you have the polygamy and the handshakes and the particular clothing the angel's wearing, and the Doctrine and Covenants showing up, and it's in southern Utah. It's all these kind of flavors that I think lend themselves to the themes as well. So, and then of course you could talk about a little bit. Well, you talk about whatever you want, but
Yeah.
like when you got involved, you brought your own kind of
Hmm.
horror opinions uh to this of like why a horror film?
Yeah, 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 I need to retrace my steps back to the original question because I was really following what you were saying and jiving with it.
Well, I mean, you're asking kind of where did it come from,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And Jessica, you brought, I mean, the motherhood aspects of it.
Yeah, well,
Phenomenal.
in an original draft of the script for the short film, there was no inclusion of children in any way, which I felt like seemed empty based on the history of this because, there are actually a lot of other reasons and justifications that people discussed in terms of why the practice of polygamy. But it still, like, the idea of bringing in more children into the world was a significant aspect of it. And so I just thought, like it's really going to complicate things if there are any child characters in this story because it's a short film and that's a lot to sort of insert into the story. But there needs to be something in there like that needs to be a sense of motivation, a sense of tension somehow. And so yeah, that was something that I contributed to the story once Barrett invited me to direct, which was you know this this anxiety and this horror and these fears and these hopes and disappointments and horrors about wanting to bring a child into the world and having some sort of the second wife when she shares that she's pregnant again refers to like again implying that there were other attempts for them to grow their family that were not successful. And so, we felt like that was an effective way to introduce, um, the hope of growing a family without needing to involve children in the story. But it also really, I think, played with, you know, experiences that are specific to a woman's perspective. And it was kind of funny because we were dealing with yeah. Well, we were trying to figure out how to work with the character
How to motivate
motivations.
the
Like,
second wife.
what would drive someone to feel justified or even in a crime of passion to actually drive a knife into her spouse.
Yeah.
And
And it's in 20 minutes. We got 20
yeah.
minutes to take her from like believing
Like, how
beautiful
watch that?
polygamous Latter-day Saint lady
Yeah, and we're parents, and so I was thinking about this,
I asked her
and
that.
Barrett's like, what would motivate you to kill me? Like, how would that be possible? And I was like,
She's like, I can think of a dozen ways.
I couldn't, and I'm like, I think if it involved what I believed would impact the safety or well-being of my own child, that could potentially be something that would motivate me enough to make such an extreme choice.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, all of that sort of helped build the story and
Well,
the
and
tensions and motivations.
then we read your family history
Yeah.
journals,
Mhm.
and there's this story of one of her ancestors. Oh, well, you saw it if you read the Tribune article, like her ancestor getting attacked by some entity, and we're just like, what is this? And
Yeah.
even the Joseph Smith, his the divine experience is accompanied with this attack from Satan. So in the story, Joseph Smith goes to the woods to pray, to be forgiven of his sins, and to find out like what church should I join. And the first character to show up on the scene is Satan, and then the Father and the Son come and relieve him, and it's this kind of like
Yeah.
scene out of a horror movie. And the same thing is true once the church is formed. The first miracle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is casting the devil out of Newell Knight, and they're like, this was the first miracle. The devil overcame him and he was cast out. And like in our tradition, it's rich with this kind of second great awakening fervor of, like casting spirits out
Yeah.
and sort of Day of Pentecost type visions. And it's eerie and it's interesting and
Mhm.
it's so rich in kind of the just the flavor of it. And
Well,
that contributed too. It's like, where is this? Why don't we
yeah.
tell? Why aren't we telling these stories? They're
Well,
interesting.
and I think to sort of add to the folkloric nature of it, I'm just thinking of, throughout scripture and also like fairy tales, these sort of consistent stories of, the fear of like a firstborn child being taken. And you have this contrast, especially in scripture stories of like these miraculous conception and birth stories, and then also these really sad, really horrifying stories of loss. Everyone remembers who the descendant is of David in the Old Testament, who survives and becomes the next king, but the child he had with Bathsheba, as a result of the choices when he, is punished for what happened in that situation, that child dies. And another story that comes to mind
Gruesome stress. It's
is
intense.
horrible. We recently introduced our daughter to the fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin. And that's another threat, is like, if she can't figure this out and deal with this monster, she's going to lose her child, because that's her, her penitence for him helping her in a magical way. And so, yeah, I think that was something, very intense, very horrifying to play with, that gave us the opportunity to sort of draw from some fable like, existing stories, and insert that into the angel.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that shows up all the time, and like we talked about, it's not nearly as common as it used to be in our technological world. But yeah, we wanted to pull from like what are the existential dreads and fears and threats in the 19th century.
Hmm. Well, you mentioned, of course, we have Catholic horror, we have Protestant horror. It probably dominates the market, those two. And then more and more people talking about Mormon horror.
Yeah.
In the past, you had a film which I thought was great, Heretic,
Hmm.
was a great film, but that was done, if I understand correctly, not by Latter-day Saints. It was somebody bringing an external perspective to it. So you're an insider, you produce this horror film, and you're drawing upon aspects of the tradition, celestial marriage, polygamy, blood atonement, these kinds of things that in the history of the church, it's worked really hard to kind of put behind it. Why did you feel that that was important to grapple with in the context of making this film? And what do you hope viewers will take away for it and the variety of reactions they might have to it?
Yeah, that's a really good
There are lots of different
question.
ways
I
we
mean,
can
there are a
go
lot of
with
ways to
this.
answer that. First of all, because it's true, it happened. It's just the history. Um, and uh, and more importantly, I actually think that um, these like episodes of history are better understood in context and through kind of like the scriptures, kind of like the Old Testament, like we just talked about, are better understood through grappling with them and working to understand them, than just kind of brushing them away. History has this, and the truth have this funny way of coming back and sort of being present. And so like while we would never go out and say like, hey, this represents everything we're about.
Right.
We would very comfortably say this represents a specific snapshot in time and place, and we have done enough research to be able to articulate kind of what the thinking was and what the ideology was and what it says about us today. And go ahead,
Yeah,
Jessica.
well,
You want
I
to say
just I
something?
just want to jump in quickly because I know we're maybe getting short on time. Another big piece is, to your question of like why explore these topics if it's sort of, trying to be put in the past. So there's actually some research, um, that demonstrates a lot of, like, if it's not the number one, it's one of the top issues that is drawing Latter-day
Oh,
Saints
right.
out
Yeah.
of the church is the issue of polygamy. And so while it's
And
something
church
that's in our
history.
pages,
Right.
because it's not spoken about or really wrestled with or understood, and sort of not discussed, a lot of times when someone is faced with history that's not necessarily presented to them within the context of the church, in Sunday school or something, it feels very jarring and very upsetting. People feel like they can't ask questions. And so I think that, that was part of us feeling like, well, this is something that might as well talk about it.
Yes, and the church, I think, like academically, in terms of the church's scholarship, has done a really great job in the past, even just the past decade, of being a lot more transparent and kind of trying to reconcile. But the culture is still the culture, and to Jessica's point, most of the time when people are leaving over these issues, Richard Bushman talked about this too, and kind of warned about this as a historian of Joseph Smith is. It generally isn't, the issue itself. I didn't really have a huge problem when I dug into church history because I'd actually read the Old Testament. And it's like, as it turns out, all of these kinds of issues are already there in the scriptures, which if we're not going to read them like within their own context, if we're going to cherry pick verses or whatnot, then we're not grappling with the complexity and the nuance of the text.
Well, it's interesting. The Old
And
Testament talks about Jacob wrestling with the Lord, and I think we forget that's sort of the whole point of
yeah,
it,
they are a
to
wrestle with
wrestle with.
God.
Yeah.
But most of the time when they leave over historical issues, it is actually rather a feeling of having felt kind of deceived or lied to or whatever, even if they weren't outright lied to, because they were presented a certain kind of version of the history, or like you kind of talked about, whitewashed or watered down or really kind of devotional. Then they discover all these things. There's no context by which to grapple with them, and then they're like, I feel like everything I have thought was this way, and it's actually that way. And the real truth is that, well, it's a combination of these things. It's very human.
That becomes very
And
deconstructive for a lot
yes,
of people.
yeah, to the majorly, kind of the deconstructing impulse, where it's like, well, now I have to just completely deconstruct this. And what I will say is that, like, what we have found, especially from young Latter-day Saints, is in terms of their reactions, as opposed to the critical success we've been humbled by with the film, the Latter-day Saint reaction, a lot of Latter-day Saints have been like, this was very ironically, like, this was good for me. This was faith promoting. I appreciated this. I appreciate that you're just talking about it, and that, like, oh, it resonates with all these things I kind of know and have heard, but we just don't talk about. And like, just by talking about it and examining it and getting over some of the kind of maybe inherited shame and the generational shame and trauma about, like, oh, you're weird, you guys are different, don't ever bring those things up. Just by talking about it and linking it to its biblical foundations and roots, all of a sudden make for a much more interesting and honest discussion. And so, yes, the church has tried to distance itself. Um, I, don't think that I think I understand why it did that, and it makes a lot of sense to me. We don't, we don't condemn the church for having done that, but at the same time, I made it a point to make sure that we were very communicative with the church to the extent that the church wanted to communicate with us about the projects that we were doing, both on a local level and on a more institutional level. And we've received nothing but support and encouragement, and just like, you know what? Like, we're in such a strange time. Like, we appreciate that you're coming at this from a perspective of faith. Um, Kind of like the Israelites, like, we're left to kind of figure some of this stuff out. And from kind of a faithful perspective, I'm like, we may or may not be right. We may or may not be right in doing this and in telling a story like this. But we definitely feel sort of a sense of kind of spiritual motivation to do it, to grapple with it in a serious way. And I think that's one of the reasons Doug Jones got involved as the angel, is because he's not Mormon, he's a non-denominational Christian, but he could tell we weren't being trite. We weren't trying to just be exploitative about these really explosive parts of Latter-day Saint history. We take it very seriously, and we're trying to tell a very, kind of self-serious
Yeah,
story,
I
if
think
that
he
makes
really
sense.
respected that, and he brought his own, interpretation and ability to engage with the character in the story
Yeah,
because
yeah.
of it.
And truthfully, I feel like every time looking, through the whole history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, um, every time that we have tried to assimilate, there kind of tends to be this cost, and it's not a good one. And where the scriptures talk about being a peculiar people and being in the world but not of the world, I take that very seriously.
Mhm.
I think it's okay to like grapple with the nuance because it's not a thing that we do anymore, in terms of polygamy or in terms of um, kind of some of the more violent interpretations of the scriptures. But that still happened, and it's useful to examine because the history's not going anywhere.
Mhm.
Well, I could talk to you two for hours, but I won't keep you anymore. This has just been wonderful. And again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time and being willing to talk about your work.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
you're
I
welcome.
appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I feel bad, John. We talked so much about theology. We didn't. We could have gotten into what the angel represents and the pieces of the story. I hope we haven't. I hope we didn't burn through that too much. But you picked some questions that are very, very important to us.
Yeah.
Well, good.
So
Yeah, I'm glad we covered those bases. And who knows, maybe we can revisit with a future conversation. But I really
yeah,
Sure, yeah.
appreciate it.
Let us
Thank
know.
you so
absolutely.
much.
So.